If you ask Battlefield fans what they think the best Battlefield of the decade was, you'll likely get one of three replies: Bad Company 2, Battlefield 3, or Battlefield 4. This video will explore if Battlefield 1 deserves to be a contender. There are a number of ways to evaluate a title from any franchise: how it stacked up to its predecessor, how it stacked up to its contemporary competition, and how it stacks up to its successor and other games that came after it. Before we analyse Battlefield 1, let's look at the games that preceded it. We have already analysed Battlefield 3, Battlefield 4 and Bad Company 2 in previous videos. If you haven't watched those yet, you can do so later. For now, here's a quick recap. Bad Company 2 perfected environmental destruction, sound design and gunplay, though it did not quite break new ground in visual fidelity compared to its contemporary competitor from Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. It also had a remarkably smaller scope for a Battlefield title, with a notable omission of planes along with the player count capped at 32 players on the PC. These deficiencies were fixed in Battlefield 3, along with a substantial graphical upgrade and an improvement in individual soldiers' customization. With that said, not all changes Battlefield 3 brought over from Bad Company 2 were upgrades though. Battlefield 3 marked a controversial regression in environmental destructibility from Bad Company 2's dynamic destruction that let players reduce entire maps to rubble with explosives and vehicles. Battlefield 3, on the other hand, featured very few structures that you could completely demolish, with destruction being limited to walls and facades. This regression is a common reason cited by Battlefield players to explain why Battlefield 3 isn't their favourite entry in the franchise. Battlefield 4 brought destruction back to the franchise in a more controlled fashion with Levolution, a series of scripted events unique to each map. Additionally, Battlefield 4 also brought a substantial increase in customization options, with a staggering number of guns, attachments and vehicle specializations to choose from. The one exception to this was soldier perks, with Battlefield 4's field upgrades being an unfortunate downgrade from Battlefield 3's squad specializations. Furthermore, the graphical improvement Battlefield 4 brought over Battlefield 3 was incremental at best, and paled in comparison to the massive leap in visual fidelity Battlefield 3 brought over Bad Company 2. This wouldn't have mattered as much if Battlefield 4 was set in a different setting from its predecessors, but that wasn't the case. It was yet another modern military shooter in a market that had already been oversaturated for years. This is why it was such a breath of fresh air when Battlefield 1 was announced to be set during the First World War, a setting that was mostly uncharted territory for the industry and for good reason. The trench warfare that has come to define the war is not conducive to fun gameplay. DICE sidestepped this problem by featuring battles that allowed for more initiative and combat strategies. However, this doesn't mean trench warfare was left out of the game entirely, as there are quite a few maps where you die to snipers instantly if you dare leave the trenches. If you're a stickler for historical accuracy in gameplay, these maps are right up your alley, especially if you're annoyed by Battlefield 1's inclusion of automatic guns, since bolt-action rifles dominate these maps by a clear mile. Gameplay was not the only challenge DICE had to overcome because of the setting. It is commendable DICE didn't let that deter them from proceeding with World War I. The setting is one of multiple factors that make Battlefield 1 the antithesis of its predecessor, impressing in areas where Battlefield 4 disappointed, while falling short of features that Battlefield 4 had introduced. For instance, Commander Mode was a Battlefield 4 feature that didn't survive the move to Battlefield 1. While this can be explained by the lack of satellites and surveillance drones commanders used in Battlefield 4, I wish Battlefield 1 allowed the same functionality from a blimp high up in the sky. For an example of an improvement Battlefield 1 brought over Battlefield 4, let's begin with first impressions, and by that we mean graphics. Battlefield 1 brought a substantial improvement in graphical fidelity, which you will immediately notice in the quality of textures and level of detail on the terrain and weapon models. The game does look noticeably worse from longer distances, as the draw distance wasn't quite up to par. Even on the higher settings, terrain and foliage can look like a last-generation title when zooming in on distant targets as a sniper, which you do more often, as you are more effective at these ranges in Battlefield 1 than in previous titles, and more on that later. Fire and explosions could also have been done better. The particle effects of the fireball and smoke look blocky, almost like a low-resolution YouTube video. This inadequacy is somewhat mitigated by the impressive lighting. The way the fire illuminates its immediate vicinity does appear authentic, with the bloom making the flames visible hundreds of meters above the surface. Battlefield 1's leap in visuals was not as impressive as Battlefield 3, since Battlefield 1 did arrive 3 years after DICE's previous title. That being said, Battlefield 1 did set the foundation for most of Battlefield 5's visuals. That's a polite way of stating Battlefield 5 brought little, if any, improvement in the graphics it inherited from Battlefield 1. It's fortunate then that Battlefield 1 looks so good it can hold its own against games released in 2019. Battlefield 1's lighting and particle effects were as versatile as they were beautiful, as was highlighted by the new dynamic weather, which feels like Battlefield 1's counterpart to Battlefield 4's Levolution. Most of the maps had weather effects that changed how the maps looked and played. Almost all of these involved the skybox fading one texture and lighting setting to another using an opacity change, as can be seen with a time-lapse from the perspective of stationary observer. This is occasionally accompanied by the onset of rain and wind picking up. While the pace was subtle enough that you wouldn't notice a change happening while in combat, you'll definitely notice the weather has turned when you respawn into the field. Maps went further by featuring sandstorms and fog that dramatically impaired your visibility and made it impossible for aircraft to acquire and attack infantry and ground vehicles. To sum it up, unpredictable weather went a long way towards convincing you that the world you play in is a dynamic environment that you have to adapt your playstyle to, and not a static, lifeless construct of geometry. Battlefield 4's Levolution seemed like it was intended to achieve the same effect with the scripted destruction and occasional sandstorm, but I feel like Battlefield 1 did a better job here. Do you agree? Which Battlefield felt more dynamic to you? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Another measure Battlefield 1 fared better was the handling of the launch, though that isn't saying much considering Battlefield 4 set a particularly low bar. Thankfully, Battlefield 1 wasn't plagued by nearly as many bugs, instability and performance issues as Battlefield 4 was during its launch. However, something that I don't understand, how can Battlefield 5 be released with the same bugs that Battlefield 1 released with, even though Battlefield 1 was released a few years earlier and those bugs were fixed and they both use the same engine? The launch was not the only lesson DICE learned from Battlefield 4. They also tried to address complaints about Battlefield 4's single player being too linear and scripted by offering larger areas with Battlefield 1's war stories, though they were much shorter than any preceding Battlefield's campaign. The shortest one did feature an interesting gimmick where dying didn't end the mission prematurely, nor restart the mission by loading the last checkpoint, instead allowing you to continue fighting as another soldier. Overall, war stories did allow for more freedom than Battlefield 3 or 4's campaigns. What was memorable was the soundtrack. Battlefield 1 has by far the best music in the franchise. No other Battlefield comes close. You'll have an easier time listening to it in the menu, as the music playing during combat is drowned out by the cacophony of gunfire, grenades and artillery. This is no cause for concern, as Battlefield 1's sound design is impeccable and excellently captures the chaos of World War I military technology. Guns sound distinct and punchy as they have in any battlefield, but the vehicles take it to the next level. The cannons on tanks and planes sound incredibly powerful from the perspective of both the gunner and the target, though if you're on foot, you'll get little time to appreciate the explosion, as you'll die in a matter of seconds, if not immediately. If you're in a vehicle, getting shelled might not kill you instantly, but may make you question the protective capability of your tank, as the impact sounds like it punched a hole clean through your armor. This makes vehicle battles particularly tense and exciting, as the teamwork it takes to win makes victory incredibly satisfying. With the exception of the FT-17 light tank, vehicles in Battlefield 1 could not swivel their turrets around a full 360 degrees, necessitating close cooperation between the crew operating the cannons and the driver. The gunners need the driver to maneuver the tank into a position that brings the targets in their range, and the driver needs to enable his gunners to eliminate enemy threats before they destroy his tank, at least until enemy aircraft notice you. Planes felt considerably more powerful in Battlefield 1 than in preceding titles. It was far easier to engage, harass and destroy infantry as a pilot, especially in modes like Operations, which entices soldiers to cluster around the objectives. You weren't completely helpless as infantry. You could man an anti-air emplacement to shoot a strafing plane straight out of the sky. Even if no emplacement was around, you could still damage planes by shooting at them with light machine guns and sniper rifles, though the slow fire rate of the latter would make it virtually useless in an anti-air role, except in cases where your shot interrupts a pilot's repair. Speaking of which, Battlefield 1 gave you more control over repairing your vehicle. In fact, it required you to take an active role in repairing your vehicle, as you can no longer count on the vehicle automatically repairing itself after being out of combat for a while. You could start repairing at any time without leaving your vehicle while holding down X on the PC. This process takes a while to complete, and the vehicle will only be repaired at the end of the process. If the vehicle takes any damage while the driver is repairing, the process is interrupted and no health is recovered. When you begin repairing, you cannot do anything else until it's finished or interrupted. This means tanks will be stationary while the driver is repairing, unless it's on a slope. You could always leave your vehicle and use a repair tool, though this does make you significantly more vulnerable to enemy infantry. You cannot do this in planes, as it would require you to land them. For the most part, pilots will have to contend with holding down the repair button, which will render you unable to control your vehicle. Planes cannot remain motionless, of course, but pilots will be unable to turn while they are repairing their planes. There is one exception to this: the heavy bomber. These have room for passengers that could repair it in the air, much like scout helicopters in previous battlefields. Bombers and attack planes are vulnerable to fighters that are specialised for dogfights, though the former do feature room for gunners who can swivel their turrets around to fire at tailing aircraft. If you don't have a teammate to serve as a gunner, you can hop out of the pilot's seat and man the turret yourself, though this does have an animation that takes precious time during which you are vulnerable to enemy attack. As a gunner, shooting down a fighter hot on your tail is so satisfying. It makes me wonder why this isn't an option in modern aircraft. Speaking of options, the UI for selecting tanks and vehicles was changed for the worse. If you spend time selecting your vehicle and its package, another player would have already spawned in the vehicle, and you'd be back waiting for another one to spawn. Sadly, this UI made its way into Battlefield 5, bringing with it all the problems players had complained about. Customization is another aspect that distinguishes Battlefield 1 as the antithesis of its predecessor. While Battlefield 4 offered so many choices it almost feels bloated, Battlefield 1 appears barren in comparison. Let's look at tanks for an example. Battlefield 4's tank had 3 options for its primary weapon, 5 weapons for its secondary, 4 options for its countermeasure, 3 choices for its optics, and 4 upgrades to pick from. That amounts to a total of 720 ways to customize your tank. Battlefield 1, in comparison, didn't offer separate choices for weapons and countermeasures. Instead, you could only pick between a couple of preset packages. The Landship, FT-17, Assault Tank and Heavy Tank, Artillery and Assault Truck all had 3 packages. Again, this feels like a consequence of the setting. Technology wasn't as versatile in World War I as it has become in modern times. This excuse does not explain why you cannot combine the primary weapon of one package with a secondary weapon or gadget of another package. Additionally, the period's technological constraints do not explain why DICE restricted the class you spawn as when you claim a vehicle. You can no longer spawn in a vehicle as any class of your choosing. Instead, you will be a tanker if you spawn in a tank and a pilot if you spawn in a plane. The only difference between them is a choice in their gadgets. The tanker can equip an anti-tank grenade and the pilot can use a flare gun to spot enemies. What makes these classes frustrating to play as are their primary weapons. Pilots and tankers are restricted to using pistol carbines, handguns repurposed with a stock to serve as primary weapons. They're as weak as they sound, being semi-automatic weapons that do as much damage as fully automatic primaries available to all other classes bar the Recon. In fact, there are a few automatic guns like the Chauchat and the RSC SMG that do more damage than some of the semi-automatic carbines. There was little reason to choose these carbines when pilots and tankers could instead use a sawed-off shotgun or a Frommer Stop Auto, a fully automatic handgun. These did give tankers a fighting chance in point-blank engagements, but were useless at anything beyond close-range encounters. This is yet another aspect of Battlefield 1 that feels like the polar opposite of Battlefield 4, which had you pick engineers if you wanted to use a vehicle. Not only did engineers have exclusive access to personal defense weapons for close-quarters combat, they could also equip shotguns, designated marksman rifles, and fully automatic carbines, which were essentially assault rifles but weaker at range. Nobody complained about engineers being overpowered in Battlefield 4. So why did DICE feel the need to nerf them so severely in Battlefield 1? Sadly, this downgrade was carried over to Battlefield 5 and arguably degraded further. For one, you no longer had any choice for your primary weapon. You get a Sten, which you can't customize, though this could be argued to be more viable than any primary weapon you could use as a tanker or a pilot in Battlefield 1. Why did DICE think it was a good idea to restrict their choice of weapons to guns that lose at most ranges? Who asked for this change? Why can't we claim vehicles with other classes like we could in previous Battlefields? The Engineer class wasn't just removed in Battlefield 1, its roles were divided between the other two classes, with Assault receiving the anti-vehicle weapons while the Support received the Repair tool. Admittedly, this does appear appropriate for their titles. Support gets to support the team by repairing their vehicles while they are busy repositioning or fighting the enemy. It's inexplicable why we cannot claim vehicles with the Support class, considering they have the tool to repair vehicles. Support was the class least affected from the move to Battlefield 1. You still get to use light machine guns and resupply your team with ammunition boxes, and shell enemies from a safe distance with stationary mortars, and like Battlefield 3 you had to man the mortar yourself, but you only had 5 shells as was the case in Battlefield 4. As mentioned earlier, Support can now equip the Repair tool, though this does occupy a slot which could have been used for a less situational gadget. The addition of this choice can be argued to be a buff, though a somewhat minor one considering it's only used in certain circumstances. The buff to the medic's role was less disputable, with the move from the defibrillator to the syringe. Unlike Battlefield 4, you didn't need to charge your syringe as it always restored 100% of your target's health instantly. The weapons available to the medic were a side grade from the assault rifles of previous Battlefields. Medics could use self-loading rifles, most of which were semi-automatic with the exception of the fully automatic Fedorov Automav, the Chai Rigotti and M1907 SL Sweeper. Many of the semi-automatic rifles have variants with long-range scopes, making them the equivalent of designated marksman rifles from prior Battlefields. Most of the rifles take 3 shots to kill, just like Battlefield 4. The only rifle that kills in 2 shots, the RSC, does not get a telescopic sight. Why not? Perhaps to preserve longer ranges as the exclusive domain of the Recon's bolt-action rifles. The Recon class saw the greatest buff by far. Not only were they passively strengthened by the reduction in fire rates across the other classes, the muzzle velocity of their sniper rifles was increased to bring them in line with the real guns they were modelled from. This was a welcome if long overdue improvement, as the guns in previous Battlefields did feel underwhelming due to how slow their bullets travelled. Battlefield 1's realistic approach to muzzle velocity was not just limited to sniper rifles, but also benefited light machine guns and semi-automatic rifles. If you hadn't noticed this yet, just look up the gun on the Battlefield Wiki, then on Wikipedia. You'll find most, if not all, guns have muzzle velocities that reflect how they perform in real life. DICE could have extended this authentic approach to bullet drop as well, but alas, they did not. Instead, most guns in the games shoot bullets that drop 12 meters every second, a significant difference from gravity in real life, which clocks in around 9.8 meters a second. Admittedly, gameplay is more important than realism, though what benefit does the unrealistic gravity bring to the experience? How would the game be any worse if the bullet drop was reduced to reflect reality? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. I'm thinking gravity might be a set constant in the game engine. An increasing or decrease in the gravity setting in the game engine will affect player movement and object physics and the like. Sniper rifles saw the greatest benefit from this increase in muzzle velocity, as their slow rate of fire makes it vital for each shot to hit its mark, and faster bullets make this significantly easier. Deploying the bipod was streamlined to be an automatic process, which would have been useful in earlier Battlefield titles. Furthermore, the range at which snipers could kill in one shot was also reworked to give each rifle a unique sweet spot where they didn't need to land a headshot to secure a one-hit kill. However, many rifles had their sweet spot start at distances that seem implausible. For example, the Russian 1895 does 80 damage from 0 to 40 meters, rises to 100 damage at 60 meters, securing a one-shot kill to the chest up to 100 meters. After which, it starts dropping again until it returns to 80 damage at 140 meters. How does it make sense for bullets to gain momentum and force after leaving the barrel? Speaking of things that make no sense, many were dismayed by the inclusion of automatic and even semi-automatic weapons in Battlefield 1. It makes sense why DICE included them. Weapon variety. considering their previous title, Battlefield 4, had so many guns and gadgets that people thought it was bloated. Battlefield 1 limiting infantry arsenal to bolt-action rifles and shotguns would have felt ridiculously empty, even if it was historically accurate. As it stands, DICE appears to have been insecure about Battlefield 1's weapon variety, as they listed variants of weapons as a separate gun. For example, the trench and factory variants of most primary weapons. In earlier Battlefields, these were just attachments and were relegated to the customization menu of a selected gun. Had Battlefield 1 stuck to this arrangement by relegating variants to the customization menu, the game might have represented its weapon count more accurately. As it stands, the weapon selection menu looks artificially inflated, with each gun having 2 and even 3 variants. Furthermore, few of the guns featured in Battlefield 1 feel anachronistic. This is why I disagree with the sentiment of Battlefield 1 being a World War II shooter disguised as a World War I game. While automatic weapons were seldom used during World War I, these guns did exist at the time, and it is interesting to be able to see and fire a virtual reconstruction in the game. The Hellriegel, for example, was only ever a prototype, and if it weren't for Battlefield 1, most of us would never have heard of it. Battle pickups made a return with kits like the Sentry or the Flame Trooper, which made you far more durable while limiting your range to close quarters. It was a ton of fun to play, though perhaps not for the targets on the receiving end. And the same could be said for the bayonet charge. Personally, I appreciate the option to use these weapons, even if they weren't deployed on the actual battlefield, as you won't get to play with them anywhere else. What I did not appreciate was the way you had to unlock these weapons. Many of the guns were locked behind assignments that you had to kill up to 300 enemies using primary weapons, and up to 50 with handguns and gadgets. A few of these required you to accrue the designated number of kills in a single round. Trying to complete these handgun assignments without pistol-only servers was a death wish, as you'd die to your target's primary weapon even if you got the jump on him, unless he was using a bolt-action rifle. If DICE wanted to incentivize players to use handguns, they could have learned from Rainbow Six Siege and removed the cap on the pistol rate of fire. They're semi-automatic anyway, so you'd still need a quick trigger finger to make the most of this buff. Forcing them to use these sub-bar pistols should not have been a requirement in unlocking any gun, let alone primary weapons. DICE did add War Bonds, a grind currency that you'd get by completing matches and could be spent on unlocking certain weapons. Why didn't War Bonds replace assignments entirely? Why couldn't War Bonds unlock all guns without having to complete these stupid chores? War Bonds could have served well alongside assignments as an alternate route to obtaining the same unlocks. But alas, this was not the case. This could have been the one area where Battlefield 1 could have benefited from being the opposite of Battlefield 4 and its ridiculous assignments. But DICE decided otherwise and stuck with the worst of their practices: tedious progression systems. Translation: the grind. Sadly, this bloated hybrid made its way into Battlefield 5's progression system in the form of company coins. We've already made other videos on that subject. You can watch those later if you haven't already. Admittedly, these assignments did keep the more inauthentic weapons out of widespread use, at least until they were completed by the majority of players. If you're annoyed by Battlefield 1's inclusion of automatic guns, you could play in maps like Galicia and Volga River, which favour the range and damage model of bolt-action rifles. Battlefield 1 had all the potential to be an authentic World War I shooter. All it needed was servers that cycled the aforementioned maps and restricted the choice of weapons to bolt-action rifles. This might have been difficult because of how these maps were monetized, the Premium Pass. This business model has been a staple of the franchise since Battlefield 3, and had long been criticised for dividing the player base between players who had purchased a pass and players who hadn't. The complaints reached a head with Battlefield 1 as its player count wasn't healthy to begin with at the time of the DLC's release. EA eventually relented and gave the DLCs away to anybody who hadn't purchased Premium yet. The DLCs, for their part, were great. The first, They Shall Not Pass, added 6 new maps, a new behemoth, the Char 2C tank, and introduced the French faction, whose omission from the base game had been controversial. The second DLC, In the Name of Tsar, added 6 more maps and covered the Russian Civil War, a setting that was at least as unique and interesting as the First World War, and arguably an equally consequential conflict in history. The third DLC, Turning Tides, was marketed as focusing on amphibious warfare, but it captured naval combat better than Battlefield 4's Naval Strike did. I was disappointed Battlefield 4's Naval Strike did not feature larger vessels and felt more like Coastal Skirmish was a more appropriate label for what these maps felt like to play on. I was delighted when Turning Tides delivered on Naval Strike's promise by introducing destroyers that posed a serious threat to enemies on the ground, in the water, and in the air. The Dreadnought also returned from the base game, though as a behemoth not everyone might appreciate its presence. Behemoths are stronger, more resilient, and more dangerous than regular vehicles. Consequently, they're a ton of fun to use, though what might not be so enjoyable to be the one on the receiving end of the barrage. To compensate, any damage done to behemoths is permanent, as they cannot be repaired. Furthermore, the game would only make a behemoth available to the losing team to balance the scales and give them a chance to get back in the fight. Even then, behemoths are only available on Conquest and Operations. Operations is a new game mode Battlefield 1 introduced to the franchise, and can be thought of as a hybrid of Rush and Conquest on a larger scale. Maps are divided into a number of sectors, each featuring a couple of control points. Attackers try to take over and keep a hold of these points to capture a sector, and defenders try to stop them from controlling all points at once. If the attackers succeed in capturing all points in a sector, they take over and the defenders have to retreat just like in Rush. If the attackers run out of tickets, they don't lose the round immediately. Instead, one of their battalions is depleted and they get to resume the fight with another battalion. If they go on to lose all their battalions, they are defeated for good. If they manage to secure all sectors on the map, the fight continues on another map. The game plays cutscenes between maps to provide context to the conflict. Only by capturing all maps featured in the operation can attackers truly win the match. It's easy to see why many players consider Operations to be Rush on steroids. Rush, for its part, had its scope reduced to 24 players, 12 on each team. Server administrators could no longer set the cap up to 64 players like in previous Battlefields. Why? Did anybody complain about Rush being overpopulated in previous Battlefields? Why did DICE deem it necessary to take this choice away from the community? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Sadly, this is but one of several changes DICE made to the Battlefield formula, to the detriment of player experience. And that concludes our analysis of Battlefield 1, an audio-visual masterpiece set in a seldom explored period, which may sadly have hampered its customization, though not nearly as the developer's inexplicable decision to restrict player choice of weapons. If you like this video, please share it. And also please check out the trailer for a little project I've been working on the side. There is more content like this on the way. Please like, subscribe and press the bell button so you don't miss out. While you're here, feel free to watch our analysis on Denuvo's history and performance impact, our analysis of Battlefield 5's controversies and our hardware analysis of CPUs and graphics cards. We have a secondary channel, link is in the description and on the screen. Please subscribe, and don't forget to press the bell button.